Heidi.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Let's see. Trying to figure out my headphone situation.
I know that sometimes the AirPods don't get them.
All right. Hopefully that's better.
That works.
Cool. Just doing that thing where I could hear but not speak, and then speak but not hear. Now I have
Yes, sometimes it works really well with the AirPods, but sometimes it's a pain to connect them or switch devices. Okay, but we talk about that anyway, about the meetings.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. How's
How
everybody
are
doing?
you?
Good.
Great.
Happy Thursday. I do know the day of the week. It is Thursday. Happy Thursday.
Pretty sure it's that.
Yeah.
It's GraphQL day. It's Thursday.
It is. Yeah. How has Thursday been unfolding for all?
It's good. It's good so far.
Awesome.
I mean, for me, it's the end of Thursday.
Yeah, you're very much in the future from a lot of the people on the call. So yeah. Awesome.
Let's see if we have any late phase pull requests. We have a bunch of pull requests open with busted CLAs. That's not great.
Yeah.
Are they older ones or are there? I did see some older ones in there, but
There are a couple
yeah.
ones that are
They're newer. Yeah.
older. Maybe that's what I'll do. Anything that's older than a month, I'm just going to close, especially if they're
Yeah.
just
Awesome.
agenda joiners.
Sounds great.
I just added myself to agenda through PR. 2 seconds.
I'm on top of it.
Hello.
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 Finally it works.
You also having Zoom issues today?
Yeah,
Zoom issues today.
I always have.
That's every day. Zoom always hacks up for me.
All right. Everything else is newish or can stay open. All right, I think we have quorum here. Is that right? Let me rename myself so I don't.
Looks pretty close. Missing Yakov, it looks like.
Mhm.
think we're close. And Mark, maybe.
David also wanted to join, but he said he will be late.
Yeah, he said he would be a little bit late for sure. Adding himself to the agenda too.
Cool. I'll merge them as I see them.
Awesome.
All right, well, let's get things kicked off since we have most folks here. And anyone who gets to join late, we'll just welcome them in. So thanks everybody for joining the very first day of September GraphQL working group meeting. Agenda file out there. Hopefully y'all got it. If not, posting a link in the chat. First thing, as per usual, of course, since we're all joining, that means we agree to the membership agreement, participation contribution guidelines, code of conduct, links to all of those beautifully super well written docs within. And as per usual, we'll do a quick around the Zoom room, introduce each other, names to faces. We will go through the order as it shows up in the agenda, because doing it in the order of Zoom attendees is always a little bit of a mess. And I leave myself on top since I'm usually the one talking first. So hello, everybody. My name is Lee.
I think I may be next. Hi, I'm Alessia.
Indeed.
Nice to meet everyone.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Benji.
Hello, it's Derek here from Apollo.
Hi all, Hugh here.
Hi, Ivan from Apollo.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeff from Apollo.
I'm Mike from Indeed.
I think Mark's not here, so I'm Mary from Apollo.
Mark is here. Mark, you're lurking.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, I'm Mark from Netflix.
Matt?
Matt, I don't
Okay.
see yet.
Okay, and then I'm Michael from jQueen.
Hi, I'm Rob.
Hello, I'm Roman from Microsoft.
I am Jakob.
Awesome. Welcome all. Mike, I think you're the only one that I don't have on my agenda item or agenda attendees yet. Go
Yeah,
ahead and
doing
send
that now.
a
Sorry.
PR and I'll get it merged. Thanks everybody for doing quick intros, especially since we got a couple of new faces. Welcome everybody. Benji, I see, is already hot on the tail of the notes and has this beautiful background projection so we can watch him do it as he does it. But I know a handful of the things on the agenda have Benji leading the discussion. So it would be awesome if we had a second person who could jump in and take notes in general, but in particular when Benji's talking. Any volunteers?
I can help.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Let's take a quick look over the agenda, make sure we're covering everything we want to today and nothing's missing. I added a couple pieces to the agenda just within the last hour or so. So if anybody else wants to toss anything on, we can talk about it now. As usual, take a quick look over action items, see if there's anything we can close out, just remind ourselves what's on our plate. Benji very helpfully did an update to how we talk about meeting cadence and TSC, which is on theme of updating our meeting times in general, which I had a proposal a meeting or two ago, I think one meeting ago. And I have some updates on that after talking to Elisa, which I'm happy to talk everybody through. Then we're going to talk about extension properties on requests, an update on defer and stream, fixing ambiguities around when schema can be used or omitted from the SDL, separating is subtype from is valid implementation field type, clarifying our resolving abstract type algorithm, looking for some feedback on expanding the subtype RFC that Jako's been working on. And then I noticed that our agenda is a little bit thin. So I figured if we have time perhaps it'd be interesting to pick up the schema metadata applied directives topic of conversation, as opposed to one specific RFC around that. That's a decent amount of things. Anything else anybody would like to talk about today we don't have on this list? Going once, going twice. All right. This is what we'll dig into. Let's then take a quick look at any action items. I'm just going to pop open these links here to see. We have none tag ready for review, which is okay. But we do have a couple that were opened from the last meeting that might be worth just double checking on and seeing where they are at. One was Benji. This was a clarifying the problem that Struct is solving as part of that early RFC. Is that still on your plate? Any progress there? Anything that we should note?
Well, if we do that discussion later that you mentioned, the schema metadata one, it is one of the things that I've posted near the bottom of that discussion thread. I've talked about a few additional use cases that I think that the other solutions to metadata don't solve that Struct does better. But other than that, I think, you know, we've already got quite a few use cases for it documented. But yes, I still need to make that more crisp.
Okay, I'll leave it open for now, just as long as that's kind of floating. Thank you for the update. The other was polling folks on what they feel the domain of the spec should cover. This was based on a conversation that Roman had started.
Yeah, I put a note there. I asked
Thank you.
for more time on this and to figure out the next step. I feel like the item says, action item says, well, what people think it is now, while I think the problem is what it should be, and I want to come up with a more solid arguments and presentation. About. If you ask me what it is now, I will give an answer that I will be not happy with myself. So basically.
Fair enough. Yeah, no rush at all. Just thank you for writing in the update.
Thank you.
Yesterday. That's very helpful. Awesome. That is all we've got floating right now. Oh, I noticed that our projects got kicked into Projects Classic. Thanks, GitHub, for renaming your projects. And I don't think there's any here that are fully closed. We have some actions that are very old, so we may at some point need to go digging through some of these. I think they have one that's almost 6 months old. But we'll leave that there for now. Okay, Benji, I'll hand it to you to, I guess, probably just update everyone. Let us know how you want to use the time to talk about the change that you've made to the TSC charter.
Sure. I don't think this actually needs very long, mostly just to let the TSC know, though I think most of the TSC noticed that today or yesterday. So as you propose changing the meeting times, Matt pointed out that that doesn't mesh great with what our TSC wording was currently. So what I've done is tried to make some minimal changes to the TSC document that allow us to manage the fact that meetings might not be monthly, they might be more frequently than monthly, while still allowing people, TSC members, to be treated as attending members. So there's been some discussion on that. I think it's already been approved by a significant number of the TSC. 1, 2, 3, 4, plus myself, 5 of the TSC. So I think the plan was we'll leave it open for review for the next 72 hours, and then we'll go ahead and merge it, I guess.
Yep, late phase. Thank you to both Matt, still not quite on the call yet. That's okay. Matt for catching it and doing the early review. Benji for writing it. It's the right change. And it's also a good segue for me to give some updates on those meeting time changes. I'm sure most of you have seen the discussion thread. I had a chat with Elisa, our PM, and she actually framed a different problem, which is that we have kind of a mess from a calendaring point of view. So luckily this meeting is more or less entirely operated through our GitHub Markdown files, but there is a calendar invite, or I think there's probably multiple calendar invites. They've been floating around different calendars and it's become a bit of a disaster. And anytime Elisa wants to go through and just get an understanding of what's happening when, she gets confused. So it was opportunistic that she framed that problem that she was trying to figure out how to solve at the same time that we've been talking about updating things. And so there's a link in the agenda doc to a Google Sheet where I'm just trying to get a full list of what are all of the events that happen over the entire domain of the GraphQL Foundation, and when have they been happening, and what's like a new cadence that we can align them to. There are subtle changes to the proposal that I had originally had that is worth talking about here to just make sure that if there's any significant feedback that I fold those in. The most significant change for this crew is my previous proposal was that we essentially do this meeting bi-weekly. I think that gets tricky where the bi-weekliness shifts based on whether months have 4 or 5 weeks in them. And that can get kind of messy, especially when the board meeting is monthly. And so I was worried about those colliding with each other. So instead, I have this set up where we'll keep the first Thursday as we have it, and then we'll just add the third Thursday as well. So that way we've got a solid 2 a month, which means half the time there'll be 2 weeks between that one and the next one, and half the time there'll be 3 weeks between that one and the next one, but that'll keep us on the monthly cadence. And also shifting the time to be sort of splitting the difference between what I had proposed before, which is much earlier than this time slot that we have today, which I think helps it line up a little bit better for a handful of folks who gave me feedback. So that would be 10:30 a.m. to 12 Pacific time, which means it would start a half hour earlier than this call usually starts, and it would end 1 hour earlier than this call usually ends. So fairly close, hopefully means minimal sort of recalendaring for everybody who joins this call on a regular basis. And then for the Asia Pacific working group, adding that at the end of the day, Wednesday, North America time, which would put it conveniently also Thursday morning for Asia Pacific. So you can kind of think about the working group as a Thursday morning call, depending on where you are, US or Asia Pacific, or Thursday evening call if you're in the EU. So that made sense in my brain. Hopefully it makes sense in everybody else's brain. And then there's more significant changes for the board meeting, which shifts today. So I got to get feedback from Elisa about that. But the other thing that I think might be helpful is we have a handful of these sort of side working groups / subcommittees that there's no one place where we track a calendar for all of them. And it might be helpful to just get all of them on a calendar so that everybody knows when they're happening if they are interested in joining. And my pitch here is to use the alternate Thursdays and have a fairly broad slot where you can just carve out 1 or 2 hours from those. And that way we don't end up in a situation where we have them colliding with each other or on haphazard days. But that is net new. So first, feedback on the cadence of this meeting. Do people feel like that's good? Any feedback there? And then second, feedback on this subcommittee sort of reservable hour blocking kind of scheme.
So the one thing that would be good to really have one calendar with all the events that we have.
That's the goal.
Also,
yep.
I also struggle with these.
Yeah, there's going to be at least our Zoom account will be sort of the master and command of all of these. And then anything that is publicly visible, which I think is everything except the board meeting and my one-on-one with Lisa, will be on one calendar that everyone can see. And hopefully that makes everything much easier to follow along with.
Lee, if I'm reading your spreadsheet correctly, it does seem to indicate that you've put the same time for the two working groups on the first Thursday and the third Thursday. But what you were saying before suggested that they would be at different times, or am I misreading it?
For this group's working group, first Thursday and third Thursday, same time of day for each of those two meetings.
Oh, okay.
And then the Asia Pacific slot would be I have that as the interleaved week. So the second week of the month on the Wednesday evening. So the Asia Pacific one is a different time.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. And we'll see how that one nets out. I may consider pushing that one to also be to the third week, just so that they're both in the same week, but I'm not sure about that yet. Not sure if anybody has strong feelings about that. Any other thoughts or feedback? Hearing silence as either I've talked about this too many times and you're bored by it, or nobody has any complaints. This seems good.
I'm looking forward to more meetings. I think this is really great.
Cool. How about this subcommittee meeting scheme of having sort of a blocked out chunk of time twice a month that subcommittees can reserve hour blocks out of?
Yeah, I like that because I missed. I wanted to attend a couple of, and then it somehow slipped always, and it would be good to have more sliced into one block there, and also have one calendar reading my top priority.
That was Elisa's bid. Yeah, that's the problem she wants to solve. So my goal is to get this in a final state and ship it to her so she can get it all on the calendar. And then starting in October, we can put this in practice. That means that there would be slight shifts to the existing subcommittee working groups. As long as I think I'm looking at Yvonne and Benji to make sure that sounds good to y'all, since you guys are spending the most amount of time in those.
Yeah, I think that should work for me.
I'm confused a little bit about spreadsheet because I looked at it at last minute, but I will, like, if you post updated version inside discussion, I will answer it offline. One thing I'm like always for moving it earlier, because like we shifted it, it started from 7 p.m. my time initially, and now it's like 9 p.m. my time, which is like a bit late. And every time we twice shifted it like later to allow like Andy to connect. And since now we have like a proper meeting, like shifting it earlier and finishing 1 hour earlier. So it's for me, it's like actually mean like instead of 11 p.m. it's like 10 p.m., which is like way better for my like sleep schedule. So I'm definitely for like for that part of proposal. As about subgroups, I will answer asynchronously if you update, because initially I look into discussion and it's not there yet. So yeah.
Yep, I appreciate that this is hot off the presses, and you have not had a time to dig into it yet. I will, since everyone is in sort of broad agreement that this seems structurally correct, I'll get this into the discussion thread. My sense is the sort of, aside from the board meeting timing, which I need to dial in with Elisa, I think everything else here looks good. And we will open up sort of a like reservation of time slots from these like second and fourth Thursdays and use those for the subcommittees. Like my preference would be to prefer the second Thursday because it kind of slots right between the first and the second working group meeting. So you can kind of like do the working group, have some thoughts, go to the subcommittee, have something come out of it, and then come to the third one with something to talk about. But we'll have both. That way there's ample times to choose from.
Slightly tangential, but I was talking with Elisa about trying to create just an index somewhere of the working groups that we have. And I suggested that maybe the actual github.com/GraphQL would be the right place, add a README there, and it can link out to the various different working groups maybe. Might be a good place for it.
Well, that's a good idea. Yeah. My original thought was to put that at the front of the working group and just listing out that there are subcommittees and here's where their repos and timings are. But certainly having like a directory at the top level is a really good idea. I like that. Okay, that's all for me. Thanks for the light feedback. We'll get it shipped and in place very soon. And with that, I'll hand the mic to Benji to talk about extensions properties.
Just a sec whilst I finish taking the notes. Cool. Yes. Sorry about the delay there. So this one's quite straightforward. Well, actually, it's less than straightforward. In the spec, we detail that the response can contain extensions. I think we detail that errors can contain extensions and various things like that. So what it's good for when we do that is it means we can reserve the top level space, so we can add any other additional things that we need to in future without introducing any problems or conflicts. And people that use the software, that use GraphQL, can add extra features inside of extensions, and that's their place to do that. So, for example, things like persistent operations could be identified by something inside of extensions without having to have it specified by the spec. However, when it comes to requests, we don't actually strictly document the shape of the request. What we do is we document what the request must contain, but we don't say how it has to contain that. And the reason that I bring this topic up is because we've been trying to formalize the GraphQL over HTTP specification. And for that, we can say, well, the response follows what the GraphQL spec says about the response. But for the request, because the GraphQL spec doesn't explicitly say that there's this structure, we have effectively introduced the concept of there being extensions on the request, but we don't have that as something mentioned in the spec on a request. So I think that we probably should. So I've added a small paragraph that indicates you may also find that there's extensions. I'm not sure whether this does belong in the spec or not, so I was really seeking an opinion on it, and if we feel it should live there, what exactly it should say.
I feel like maybe it doesn't, because the purpose of explicitly defining extensions in other places was because we were already talking about a data structure, and we're specifically concerned of naming clashes within that data structure. So the response, like the spec defines the data structure of the response, at least in terms of like at a high level, like there is a map, there are key value pairs. And there was the potential problem of, if I wanted to add something else into the response, like where would I put that? And if I named it something that collided with the spec in the future, how do I circumvent that problem? But execution does not describe it. There's no data structure. There's just, as you mentioned here, there's just sort of a list of things that you need. You need the schema, you need the document you're executing, and then optionally a couple other things. But because we don't necessarily need to talk about that in terms of a data structure, it's just sort of like, this is the collection of stuff that you need. I don't know if we have the same problem of a collision. But certainly to the degree that HTTP in specifying a protocol certainly would need to define the data structure by which you submit a request. It seems very wise that that would define some way in which you would extend it.
So the main concern and the main reason that I feel that maybe we should put it in the spec is because when we come to document, for example, GraphQL over WebSockets or GraphQL over other protocols, they will likely also need to specify extensions. I mean, if you're doing persisted operations, for example, you need to do that over whatever channel you are issuing those requests. And I'm concerned, I don't want each of those specs to each be responsible for defining this same concept over and over again. We need kind of a central location for it. But equally, I agree with you because there is no structure defined for requests. So that's what makes it a little bit more tricky.
Is this maybe a non-normative note? Like, because we have a note in that same section that you're editing that mentions the fact that GraphQL doesn't require specific serialization format or transport, and that those are chosen by a service. Is it worth adding a note that says something similar to what you're framing here, that the list above is sort of this is the requirement for GraphQL to function, but it's not the limit? Like, you could add additional values to implementation specific values for a request if necessary. But then maybe that's a good place to mention the potential problem of a collision with a GraphQL required field. Maybe that's like an annoyingly subtle suggestion that's not helpful, but
what is collision can be? I think it's outside the request, right? It's where now we have variables, the query, and now extensions, right? It's on the very top level, this field. I like it actually. It seems like equivalent of, for example, headers in HTTP. Put whatever you want and get whatever you want. So I don't see any problems with this from the server side. It's a nice feature. We just allow clients and servers get together and use this additional field and kind of standardize so that clients, the client tools know about it. No surprise.
I guess everyone's in favor of the feature, just which spec it should live in.
Sorry, what's the protocol here? I've had my hand up for a while. Is there someone calling on people, or?
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Is it just wait for a lull and talk? Okay. My one note is I do think this is something that is important to specify somewhere, whether it be in the GraphQL spec or the HTTP spec. I don't have a great handle on that. The one thing I'll say is this is something that like Apollo started using for sort of informally as an extension of the spec for our persistent queries along like 4 years ago or something. And an actual challenge that we did actually have that like made it challenging for us to have clients that sort of optimistically start using these extensions, and then if they're ignored by the server or whatever, is that there were actual servers whose, for posts, for example, whose like JSON, they would parse the JSON and they'd say, oh, unknown field in JSON body error, don't process anything. So I think the important thing, and again, I'm not positive this needs to be HTTP level or spec level, is that servers should not return an error if there is an extensions field at the top level. Whereas you can imagine wanting to return an error for other typo, operation name with an underscore or something. It's an error, it's a typo. But yeah, preventing servers from rejecting things with extensions is, I think, the important goal here, not specifying what they should do when they get it.
That makes sense. Vaughn, go ahead.
I wanted to suggest, like, right now we have like two subsections, data and errors. An extension is like, extensions is important and is actually spreading, because initially we had only one extensions in response. When we added extensions in errors, now we're adding extensions inside stream and default payload. So now we're up to like, even inside the spec itself, up to with 4 places where extensions are used. So I would suggest to like make it like a proper section, describe it, And maybe it's like as a middle ground, people can reference it. So it's like, it will be like a spec inside the spec. So GraphQL over HTTP basically can reference this section on what this concept is, and say like request payload like follow extensions semantic from GraphQL spec. I think it will benefit our own use case because we will have like 4 places, and it will benefit like everybody else, not only in request everywhere. So yeah, basically I'm like for having top level and making it abstract and reference it in our 4 places and allow other people to reference it in other specs. Sorry if it's like suggesting more work than Benji's PR proposed, but I think it's correct solution.
I think I agree with the broad strokes of what both of y'all just did at. I think that the thing that feels not quite right about this current framing is like specifically the idea that there may exist an entry called extensions. It's like an entry on what? The spec has not defined a thing on which there could be an entry yet. And so it just feels out of place, where the previous set is like just a list of abstract things, but not necessarily like the spec doesn't require that there's a data structure with a schema field at which the schema is provided, or the document. Like some of these things are provided by the server, some of them are provided by the client. It's just in order to do a request, like these are the total set of things that need to exist, which maybe means that we could be more clear about what is necessary there. But maybe the simplest possible change is to add just another thing to this list that just says an implementation defined set of extensions or transport specific data as necessary as well. Just to David's point, making sure that if a service sort of rejects something, be like, wait, this seems not aligned with this piece of guidance, that we could accept implementation specific additional information. I think the common one that usually sticks out to my mind is headers. So people have asked a bunch of questions about headers before. Like, is it okay to add custom headers to an HTTP request that runs a GraphQL execution? It's like probably okay, but as long as you name them as according with custom headers usually are named.
Okay, so going forward, it sounds like it might be a good idea to add an entry to the above list that speaks more generically about this extensions rather than using the backticks and using the word entry. And then potentially adding a small subtitle that talks about why there would be extensions. And also, I think, and this is why I didn't want it to be a non-normative note, specifying that it should be a map. I think the fundamental of it being a map is something that everything can then rely on. And then beyond that, we don't specify it.
It also, well, I mean, have brought up headers kind of intentionally as a counterpoint to the map. It's like if that it implies something about that you're going to capture this as a JSON body or something as part of the submission, which may make sense, but maybe it's a form multi-part, maybe some of this data is in a header, maybe some of it comes out of a cache and gets sideloaded. I think it might be too presumptuous on the transport to suggest the data structure.
But we suggest data structure for response in our description of the data in serialization in section 7.2. I'm looking at it right now. It's actually like specify map, and we have just like a table mapping it to JSON map. So we already use map as an abstract data structure in text.
Yes, we use it for the entirety of the response, and in some cases for input for variables. But I guess I'm missing the value. Like it seems like it adds restriction without a lot of benefit. Because if we define that it must be a map, that means that you cannot use a header to supply some of this metadata, which feels like an unhelpful restriction.
I think it's okay if anybody wants some extensive structure, put it under well-known, or under some key inside the map. I think it will be also easier for graphical and other tools to show it. At least at the top, we say it's key value pairs. Beyond this, we don't care, and they can actually reserve a grid or something there in the UI to show this stuff. It will be much more challenging if we don't specify any structure at all. So I think it's okay to continue, just like with variables and some other stuff. It's key values.
I'm
Okay,
open to it.
Would that be though, like that would be at the GraphQL like engine level, right? The map, because I agree restricting that at the transport level, like headers don't work, content types don't necessarily work. Like that seems very, very restrictive, especially for things like extensions. I feel like headers are a great choice, like a lot of the time. So it would suck if we didn't support headers for that stuff.
Maybe that's the right slicing. I think you two both caught on to the right. Like there actually is there's like the transport has this ability to do sort of, pre-assembly. It's like given headers or whatever, if it's a different transport that has something else, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways in which a transport might define something that makes map unintuitive, which might be fine as long as the result of that sort of transport layer intake step is the production of a map that has the relevant pieces that it then puts through to the GraphQL engine. That seems reasonable, because I do agree that section feels underspecified, and it is in some cases unclear because the schema, for example, is provided by the server, not by the client, and they're just sort of intermixed as in, like, this is the full set of things that you need to do in execution. And we could be more clear with that.
I'll just throw out there that a challenge with using headers is that there's typically a length limit on the max size of all headers. So if you're thinking about putting long things, then headers can be a challenge. And there's also the cores issue of like if every little feature you want to add involves like a bespoke header, then that probably means if you want to use this in the web context that you're going to need to, and depending on whether or not you've configured your server to accept all headers or not, it might require server configuration, whereas just adding more stuff to the request body doesn't have that impact.
That's certainly true. And my point here is not that headers are the right way to do it or the wrong way to do it. It's just that I think it would be, in fact, like that is the point. Like if the spec made it not possible to use a header for a feature, that seems like it's not adding a lot of value and it's removing that value, because your guidance here is sound, but there are definitely cases where a header could make sense. And so I think the goal that I want to uphold here is that we put as minimal restrictions on the transport as possible, so we can sort of be maximally aligned to any new transport that people want to use, and then lean down on subspecs like GraphQL over HTTP to define what you can and can't do within there, to map through to say that you are using this particular variant of the transport in the way that it purports to be used, such that tools can engage with it effectively.
I have a question about headers, because like right now you can use headers even in response. Nothing prevents you from using headers. You don't need to put everything inside the extensions. You can use headers, and we have extension just as like to provide name clashes in serialized part. So basically, if as I understand, Benja's proposal is also not to forbid like headers in request. It's like if you have payload, inside payload, you will have extension which is map. So I don't think like if we formulate it in a way that protocol wise you can add whatever you want, but if you send some payload and inside payload on the top level, you have extension as a map. And it's work both for request and response, because for response, for example, I measure execution time of a query right now. I can put it inside the extension and I can put it as a response header. It's like, so I think we keep symmetry in a sense. So I would just restrict extension to serialized payload, but allow it, but require it to be map and require it to be on, like on the top level and designated spots inside.
That's fair. Benji, it seems like you have two possible paths, with probably up to you to decide which one you want to take. One, which is sort of the minimum viable path of just mentioning the fact that such an extension could exist and to be aware of it. And the second, sort of more maximalist path of improving this section and doing a better job at defining what the actual total input is to an execution as in the form of a struct, which once it's a struct, then there's this question: if you add something to it, how do you avoid a collision? In which case your suggestion applies.
Okay, cool. Thanks for everyone's input.
I'm afraid just making a separate section, there is nothing except these two sentences. And I don't know, essentially it says it's free form key value pairs thing optional. And not much to describe.
Sure.
We can describe like fields as optional, not as required, but optional fields that we know for sure can be used, like operation name or query, or just make it optional.
In a separate spec, maybe, for specific servers can publish that they have these keys. But in general, for the spec, so far, I guess in some future, yes, but in general, it's completely custom. It's not for the spec. We declare we will not mess with this field, right?
Yeah.
All right, I want to make sure we have time for Rob to go deep on his update. So Rob, will hand it to you. Talk about the front stream.
Hi. So I have spent some time the past couple of weeks getting the spec PR up to date with all of our previous discussions. So I think that is ready for some thorough reviews. Also, the GraphQL JS PR that has been open for a while has been merged to the main branch. So that's on like the 17 alpha. It's all the changes are behind experimental execution functions. So not the standard execution. But yeah, and there was another issue that Benji had opened that I wanted to discuss a little bit. I'm going to share my screen 1 second. So the basic so what's happening here is we had previously discussed about nulls bubbling up from inside of deferred or streamed payloads, and this is kind of the opposite situation. So you have some fields that are being deferred or streamed, and I guess kind of adjacent to that, there is a field that could encounter a non-null error, which bubbles up to the parent of both this field and the fields that are being deferred or streamed, causing kind of the place where you would be setting these deferred values to have become nulled out. So because like the defer execution's happening in parallel, it's not canceled out by this. So I guess kind of want to get thoughts on this of I wrote up a pretty quick implementation of something that would strip out these deferred fields. And it's a little bit clunky in my opinion. Basically what has to be done is, at least in GraphQL JS, we kind of don't really know. We know that a non-null error happened and it has bubbled up somewhere, but it's the mechanism that we're doing that is just through throwing and catching JavaScript errors. So we don't really have like this error corresponds to which fields have been nulled out. So this function will kind of like every time we're ready to present a payload to the client, we will look at that response and basically go through all of the executions that are happening for defer and stream, look at their paths and see if their paths have been nulled out on the response. And if so, if it's a stream with an iterable, we can return that iterable. Otherwise, we can discard it. And that ends up without any of these being sent to the client. It's not optimal, I think, because we do have to like, we can't just like compare paths. We have to actually look at the response. But this does work. So I guess I want to hear if there's any thoughts on that.
Didn't we initially say that these defers are null boundaries? Like we don't care about these? When in these boundaries something happens. Now it's happening on the main request, you say, and that leads to tasks being cancelled.
Yeah, here's the example. It could be on the main initial payload. It could be on a deferred or a stream that has kicked off other more downstream deferent streams.
There's sort of two issues here. One of them is that you can actually send some data to the client and then 5 seconds later discover that, oh, something below it, nulled at the wrong time. And that thing we actually sent, like the client is going to have to do some high level understanding of like this, this thing that actually got sent has been nulled. And that is basically unavoidable, I think. The other question is, what happens if those two things happen close enough in time that you would be sending them in the same batch, essentially, or in parallel, essentially. And so this is more about, should we try to do the best that we can do with these conflicts when we're actually sort of sending things at the same time, as opposed to, or even in the future, as opposed to, a client still needs to, no matter what, be able to understand that, like, a thing that was sent might now have to be nulled out.
But isn't it guaranteed that we cannot send something down to the client? Because if we spawn something from another request, like from the main request, if we spawn a task from that up, we cannot send this task before we send down the main task. So we are guaranteed to find this null violation on the server.
Yeah,
and the same happens in sub-defers. Like we cannot send this sub-defer before we send the task from which we spawned it. So we are guaranteed to find them all.
Well, sorry, are you guaranteed to find all the ones that do happen at the same time, or that there's never there's never a case that we've already told the user something and then we have to null it back later?
No, even if they are happening at the same time, the server has to hold them until the main request into which they are patched into can be sent down.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, the very simple case here is just like, I mean, it's basically what we have at the screen here. No, I think what's on the screen would be a little more clear if the non-null on numbers was like on the inside the parenthesis, inside the brackets. The point is, if you're not deferring like always throw, like that is not deferred at all or streamed. It should be sent at the very beginning, but it'll have to go boom if if numbers starts returns if numbers returns bad stuff. I think this would be more clear with defer than with stream. I find it a lot harder to wrap my head around stream.
Yeah, ideally the spec
Yeah, but
does not take an
but-
opinion on when the streaming begins, and is more like we should describe that there's. It's more important to describe when the stream payloads are delivered and what the constraints on them are. And
there are
right?
two things like but there are two things like we have this example from Ivan here. In this case, it doesn't matter because defer is a null boundary. So a null violation doesn't bubble out of this boundary. At least that's what we defined so far. So we can guarantee that.
I think I was confused because I think I didn't understand what you were saying about it being a null boundary. I think that is something I had not seen that decision.
Yeah, because we at one point we said so because we could have sent the main part down, and now in the deferred task, we actually found out that we have a null violation that actually would null out the original part that we already sent to the client. So we defined that the defers are actually null boundaries, and that means we don't have the problem, and we can fix it. Like we know we cannot deliver parts from which we spawn something off before the spawned task, and we don't have to worry about things that are already sent because there are null boundaries. So it should.
Do you have a link to where the null boundary was? Which one the null boundary was discussed on?
Yes, there is Rob has
23. I will say that what is the status of the overall GraphQL proposal about like client controlled nullability? Because it seems a little weird to put in what is essentially client controlled nullability as like a sub feature of defer.
I mean, I think that it's like I think we have to define that a null can't bubble up higher than a defer stream boundary because the results have already been sent to the client, so that you can't go back and
otherwise
change
you can't defer. Yeah,
right.
Otherwise, defer wouldn't be possible.
You'd have to wait for everything to finish before you sent anything.
I think
yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to mention is that I posted earlier, we have this discussion about enforcing delivery order of payloads. And I think at the time we mentioned that it would be much easier for clients if we did enforce that. And I think this is one example. What David's mentioning is it's definitely one example. I mean, you could get a payload that would eventually have to be nulled out. You would have to manage that. But we did raise the possibility of, I think, at the time of one day relaxing that requirement, or maybe adding an argument to relax that requirement, and then we would get into the situation. But and possibly we might in the future. Maybe I guess there would be a if you would use such an argument to allow out of order delivery, then you might this filtering might be just unnecessary because you have other problems. But as we have it now, I think it's a great idea.
And out of order delivery doesn't nullify that, right? Because out of order delivery we considered for lists, not for these defer boundaries. So we would still have like an order, like out of order boundary is not a problem for the client to patch something in. We just have to tell it.
Yeah, no,
where to put it.
I think if I were, well, actually, I'm not sure. I think when in my head, considering that we didn't rule it out completely, even in terms of defer, but maybe we did. Again,
I think we have both defers and streams. We have as ordered, like in the future, if we want to relax that, I think that it would require some sort of client opting in because it would break assumptions that I'm sure clients would be making. So I think that like these other implications could be discussed at that point.
Yeah, hands up.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree.
Yep.
I wonder if because I noticed in the thread there was this proposal to wait to begin the stream until it's known that it's safe to do so, and then there's a concern about that being a performance burden. But what actually matters here is the perceived result, and if there's optimizations, then we can always do those sooner. Like an equivalent is you could, if you have GraphQL caching, it may be the case that you've run all of these executors long in the past and you've cached the results. And so, you've already actually done all this work before the spec says these steps must occur in this particular order. And you're just, recreating them. But to the observer, it looks as if the algorithm is run in the particular order and the result makes sense. So I wonder if the way that you get yourself out of this particular pickle is for anything that is either streamed or deferred within a particular selection set, you first wait until you're in the complete value of that selection set. So you know that anything that could have synchronously returned null or asynchronously, just like in the course of asynchronously resolving that selection set, you're now to the point where you've finished it and you don't have anything that bubbles. And that's the moment where you say, now you begin doing your defers and your streams with a note that says you could start your stream sooner than this if you want to for performance reasons. However, the result would need to match this behavior. So in the case that something does cause the selection set to be nulled out, you would want to cancel that stream and make sure that you're not sending any payloads.
Yeah, it's basically up to you where you optimize that.
Yeah, that way the preemptive fetch is the choice by the server rather than a requirement of the spec to yield better performance in exchange for more complicated stream canceling behavior.
But with GraphQL JS being both trying to be a very close implementation of the spec and a very widely used library, would it be weird that if GraphQL JS wasn't doing what the spec described and was said doing this filtering for performance? And
I don't think it's weird. Actually, what might be, because I'm thinking of cases where it's not super intuitive as to which behavior would actually yield the best server-side performance. And a server-side author might actually want control over when these streams begin. Maybe it's the case that the odds that one of the neighboring fields throws is fairly high, and a lot of these streams get canceled. Or the initializing the stream is just really expensive, and the whole kind of value add of doing the stream to defer the payloads of those was just not, you didn't get the benefits because it was the initialization of the stream that was expensive rather than each payload. Something like that. But so there may be a case where a server author actually wants control over that. So it could be interesting to default to the optimized path, but allow it to de-opt or vice versa. Which would then be kind of a nice way to illustrate both the spec behavior and the optimized behavior. But even if you just did the optimized behavior, it wouldn't bother me that much that there is a deviation, as long as it aligned to something that was mentioned in the spec. And then you could sort of comment there and say, this does this preferred, performance improved path as mentioned as a possible note in the spec. Here's how it works and how it differs. That way you could kind of reserve the implementation details for the reference implementation and not worry quite so much about the spec impact.
Can I make sure I understand the issue clearly? Because I actually think at the beginning of this discussion, and even having read this before, I was very confused. We are apparently all in agreement, which I didn't understand, that we have a null boundary in the sense that things happening inside the first stream do not affect things outside. You can null fields with the first stream without affecting anything about their siblings or their nieces or whatever. And this is about the other way around. This is about non-deferred nulling pushing down into deferred stream. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I actually did not realize that. I didn't realize the null boundary thing. I think it's a little, I'm curious how folks doing client side things, if they were aware of that, Alessia or anyone to visit, essentially adding nullability to GraphQL, ignorable nullability for the first time is a little interesting, but yeah.
David, you can think of it more as like a skip that's dynamic. So if they can't populate it, then it's as if it was skipped. Those fields just don't get populated. They're not even there. They're not null. They just don't exist.
Yeah, but I think sorry.
Yeah, let's let Yvonne jump in.
I wanted to ask practical question about like what to do in GraphQL.js, because looking into data is not effective. Even if we wait for data to resolve, it's still not like, even if we wait for entire payload, we still need to look into. So we have technical ability to track what was blown. A question here, like previously, everything we tracked internally on errors, we exposed like publicly in response, meaning like we track original path where error originated, and we expose it as a path. So back to Rob's PR, like for performance reason, it definitely makes sense to not check like every time, not check like a data, but for error track, like what was blown by each error. Question here, is it like we should keep it as implementation detail or like a separate thing, a separate like proposal? Is it something that we're interested in exposing or not?
I think the client is capable of figuring out where that field is by doing the data traversal, which it will be doing anyway. So I don't think that adding the error blow up path as opposed to the error originating path provides much value, and I'd rather not add it unless we particularly think it would be beneficial. So I think just track it as an implementation detail.
So example on like client gets a response and it has next true. So like next payload is expected. So client need to check if a particular stream and defer were blown out or not. So now client need to inspect like parsec, like parsec query, and inspect data.
There is errors field in each item in stream, right? I'm looking at response.md around line 278. And it says it may contain the response item, as far as I understand. It must contain items path and may contain label, errors, and extensions. So it means that whenever the stream is blown up later, so instead of data, we can deliver this item with errors. And in this case, let's say we can, so we cancel the stream probably, but at this point, everything is forgiven. We delivered error and may say has next false, bye-bye.
Yeah, the discussion is more around the GraphQL engine actually would bubble that up further. And this logic the client has to repeat if it wants this behavior. But I think anyway, if a user puts in the further, then this is a decision, and this has to be handled then. So you're anyway splicing your request. And if you look at the original implementation of that, the batch implementation, there, I mean, defer allows us to have that in one query, but originally these were two things. Anyway.
So what you're saying is that we're talking about implementation, GraphQL.js implementation that doesn't match this, that actually would bubble error higher. The problem is, my question is, the problem is the spec and general behavior or particular implementation, GraphQL.js? Because from the spec point of view, it looks fine to me and reasonable.
Yeah, I'm actually rethinking my question. So I think with like actual thing at hands, actual problem at hand, we can do it as implementation detail in GraphQL.js. And if we spot the same problem in a client and we will have a client doing the same thing, we can think about exposing. So I'm basically like taking my question back. I think it's something that we can add later.
I mean, I think that like we could describe in the spec generally that like these types of that if you have this case, like this stream shouldn't ever be returned to the client because it's like under a field that's been nulled out by something that hasn't been deferred or streamed. We don't have to describe it exactly the way I wrote it. The way that I wrote it, I think, is more of a consequence of that. This may not be true, but it seemed more difficult for me to keep track of because the error path refers to the field that nulled out and not how high it bubbled, and keeping track of that seemed more difficult in GraphQL.js at least. That's not like super clearly defined, like an exact algorithm of that. I don't think is in the spec either, because it's relying on try catches in JavaScript. I still just like would be hesitant to describe in the spec that you should wait to begin execution until the other fields resolve, because I'm just worried that someone who implements that is going to end up with defers, like stretching out the time that it takes to do the whole request by many multiples that it would have been without the defer. And I don't know. I would
maybe this is too specific of a suggestion, but maybe just to give you an idea of a way to format this. But I think one way is, or two different ways I would think about marking this stream as in a bad state and it needs to abandon. One is to look like there's this constraint of there's the path into the previous payload that I need to be applying my results into. And I should, before shipping a payload, verify that that path exists. And then that is like complicated for the reasons that you're describing. The second would be at the moment that the error occurs to sort of already know what the affected streams would be. And so in the course of doing the bubbling behavior, mark those deferred stream or like the stream payload as have some flag on them that marks them as broken, or explicitly cancel them in that moment. And I think the reason why that second one doesn't feel reasonable to implement right now is just the way in which you're doing the collection. So all of the deferred, or how do we frame it in the executor definition? I'll look at the right subsequent payloads. Okay, so we have this idea of subsequent payloads. The way that we're collecting subsequent payloads is that we create a mutable list at the beginning of the execution, and then we pass that mutable list down, and then we append to it along the way. But the other way we could think about this is that steps can return a tuple of the value that they usually return, and then also subsequent payloads, and then we just union those subsequent payloads as we go up. And that way, at any particular moment, like you're in the complete value step and it fails because there's null bubbling or something like that, at that moment you have that union set of every subpath within you have all of those subsequent payloads, and then you can cancel them and return up an empty set of subsequent payloads because none of those apply anymore. And so when you get to the top, all the subsequent payloads that you've gotten from collecting that very first field in the query type. Those are the ones that did not get canceled along the way.
So from a spec point of view, I agree with you, Lee. That is certainly a way that we could express it. But from an implementation point of view, I actually implemented that in a personal project and also implemented the other one where we basically do it at the top level. And the other approach is, at least in JavaScript, significantly faster because you don't need to create all these temporary objects that you're then throwing away, these tuples, because you can just do it at the root level, do a one-time check, and you also don't incur any cost for doing it if no errors occur. And generally, we like the no errors case. So having to do no additional effort when there are no errors, I found favorable.
Yeah, but I agree with Lee. It's a good mental model. So when we explain things and when we think about things, and by optimization, and it's actually like a function of programming, which is like fancy. So yeah, as mental model is great.
There's also subtle performance improvements you can do for that, like do late unioning. So rather than actually merging lists at every particular step, treat the empty case as null. And when you're doing the merge, just have a list of all of what you've gotten from the children, and then wait until you're at the very top step. You don't even have to do a flattened list. You could just sort of iterate the tree that you've collected there. So you can kind of, skip past doing a union at every single field and therefore skip a lot of the performance burden. And then you're only creating those lists when any one of those children have that. So in the case where an entire subtree has created no subsequent payloads, you've just noticed along the way, there's just like, you've gotten a bunch of nulls, and then therefore there's nothing to merge, and you can just return up null. That may also have performance costs. I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing on an implementation idea, but suffice to say, there's probably some variant there that allows you to use the non-mutable approach, and therefore like get this benefit of, oh, actually this thing hit an error scenario and should not be bubbling up any results, and therefore also does not bubble up. Because like that's, I think the root of the issue here is that you are mutatively adding entries into a list before you know that the behavior that you're operating is going to successfully or non-successfully complete. And ideally what you do is like, once that is successfully or non-successfully completed is the moment when you merge it into that list. Maybe there's some hybrid of the two that kind of gets the best of both. I'm not sure, but my caveat there was maybe that's too specific, but like just to give you another mental model of thinking about it, that might help you find a mode that feels less hacky. Hopefully there's some variant of that ends up being useful.
I think maybe even just checking that immutable list at the place where the errors are thrown, maybe that's doable. I'd have to like look into it some more. I do want to say, do we definitely not want to consider the option of this could happen, clients have to deal with it?
No, I think it's good because we can do it. I mean, we are very well equipped to not send it down. And in this case, we save bandwidth because we anyway know it shouldn't be sent down. Why send it?
Okay.
I think it's good to hold this. It also holds us to the sort of golden constraint that we've been trying to keep a hold on this whole time, which is subsequent payloads are definitely mergeable into, like, if you've merged all the payloads in order, each net new payload can also be merged. And that like drove the decision to order them in the appropriate way. And I think is also probably the right way to think about what happens when the previous one had a problem.
That's a good catch.
Yeah, I'll look into that a little bit more, seeing if it could be resolved at the time of the error being thrown. And think more about describing it in the spec.
Real problem.
Yeah.
I think we got some ideas on angles on how to solve it, but props to you and Benji for digging into the weeds and finding this and having an approach.
Yeah. All right. I also wanted to get clarification on what stage this proposal is. I think that actually a long time ago we had said that it was stage 2, but I think that the spec PR still has the stage 1 tag. So I'm not really sure exactly where we are.
Let me remind myself of the definitions that we set ourselves for those.
I mean, we are very close, and there are a couple of implementations out there.
Yeah, and we figure out edge cases basically right now.
Yeah.
So the entrance criteria for draft is consensus that the solution is preferred via the working group. It seems probably the case. Resolution of identified concerns and challenges. I don't know if that means that literally 100% of problems have to be resolved, though. Precisely described with spec edits, we're at least close to that, and compliant implementation in GraphQL.js, which is good. So that seems we're at least very close to all those things being true, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, it's totally reasonable for a draft to contain issues and errors that are getting worked out, where the result of fixing those errors is subtle changes. Like obviously the mutable versus non-mutable list thing is like feels big in terms of the spec language, but like in practice is fairly minor relative to everything else. That definitely still feels like changes relative to a draft. So okay. Yep.
One notable thing that doesn't exist that would stop us from going to accepted, which I know is not the discussion on the table, is that the spec edits don't have many examples, which I think that Ivan and Rob were talking about working on soon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We would certainly want that for an accepted state. It's like, especially this is by far the most complicated addition to GraphQL since it's open sourcing, which is part of the reason why we've been having sustained effort for so long. And I imagine that there's going to be a lot of like material outside of the spec to help people learn about it, and a little bit of stuff within the spec to help them learn as well. But okay. Answering your question, it is in fact stage 2.
Woohoo.
I think you're right, Rob, that we did probably talk about that before and just forgot. And so this is more a matter of just getting that PR updated correctly.
It's exciting. Congratulations, Rob and everybody.
Can I ask something? First of all, guys, I submitted a few notes into the PR. Haven't seen them to spec edits.
Yes, and you already got feedback to a couple of them.
Yeah,
I haven't been able to really look at them too closely yet.
Yeah. Okay, but in the context of what Lee said, that this is most complicated addition to the spec since open sourcing it. I don't know, did you already discuss this or not? But what occurred to me when I was reading the additions to the spec, should this stuff be in the main spec or it can have its own spec? Because it looks like the material is spread all along much bigger spec, making it read the basic material much harder, and at the same time making it harder to understand this defer and stream, and also defer and stream, they're mixed together. That's my impression. Would it be beneficial to leave the main spec alone and create another spec, and maybe this will be the first spec out of number of them for complex features that deserve their own spec all in one place, for example. Maybe we don't need to discuss it now, but something to think for the next meeting. But I think it makes total sense for me. The spec is already kind of challenging enough to understand
It's a good point.
first reading.
Yeah, it's a good point. If possible, I would prefer that this does not end up being a separate spec, because I anticipate like there's both a kind of a forking challenge of every change to the main spec will need to be, from the point on that this gets merged, we'll always need to be keeping in mind asynchronicity behavior relative to any other change that we make. And doing that all in one document will, I think, be a little bit easier. But your point about legibility is very on point. And I think one of the editorial criteria that I'll be looking for is, does this feel sort of maximally isolated from the rest? Like, can you read most of the algorithms of execution and then just like skip over the parts about streaming and defer, and it still really kind of makes sense? It's like in the case where a deferred stream isn't encountered, there's just like a large branch of the algorithm that you can just kind of ignore, which might aid that. And right now that's kind of true, and maybe it could be a little bit better. I don't know exactly how far along that continuum will be able to get, but it's a good point. It's especially execution is by far and away the most challenging section to read already, and making that worse is not great from a legibility point of view.
But
another thing, it's so optional. It's so optional. That's an important point. You say at the beginning that servers do not must, right? That's a big point. Well, what if I'm initially not interested in these things? And nothing wrong having like what is this relay spec on something on top of the basic spec, other specs that build on that, but live in separate documents. Okay,
but relay spec is something completely different. Like it's outside of the GraphQL group. I mean, that's something that the relay team defines as a guideline to use relay optimally.
I don't see a realistic way that this could be completely separate from the main spec, in that it really does change fundamentally like how execution works. If we are concerned about making big changes, I would say, I think it would be nice to just get the whole thing done. We've been working on this, or you mostly have been working on this for many years. One could consider, if we wanted to be a little cautious, doing this incrementally, merging sort of subsets of it. One could imagine maybe the first change that's merged to the spec is just defer and not stream, or pulls back on the combining defer and stream with subscriptions, which, to be honest, I think has a very strange, we don't use subscriptions much on our platform anyway, but like the way that defer stream works on subscriptions feels a little strange to me, and it's hard to imagine why people would, like, how people could really use it. So if we are concerned about the scope of it, one option would be like, starting with defers on queries and mutations only, and leaving streams, which a lot of the complexity is in streams, and subscriptions for follow-up. That said, I think it would also be great to just get this working group over with and celebrate and move on.
It's a good point. We've brought that up before as well. I think in anywhere where we're not feeling really confident, as counterintuitive as it is, we should in fact have the most restrictive behavior, because it means we can come back to it and add in, as opposed to having a behavior that is less restrictive. Makes it harder to then go in and add restrictions in the future. The adage of if it is possible, it will happen seems to be applying quite a fair bit in the GraphQL domain. So you have to be careful there. But David, I think you make a really good point. Like if we're getting into a space where, defer feels super baked and ready to go, and stream is just like constantly getting hit by thorns of the next thing, or if the interaction with subscriptions is like there be dragons territory, I would certainly not be opposed to doing an incremental ship where we put restrictions in place that protect our ability to come back to that and add it back in. Well, starting to collect feedback by shipping this out to the broader populace, I think that would also be really good. But I'm also with you. Like I think it feels like the set of problems we're encountering are getting smaller and smaller and corner casier and corner casier. So it does feel like we're getting really close. Awesome. Well, I updated the PR to have the appropriate tag and dropped a comment as to why. Awesome work. And thanks everyone who's been digging in and doing detailed review on the spec text. I think, as we start to round out the implementation specific quirks, we can get to the spec text quirks.
Well, can I do one last thing on the topic before we move on?
Go ahead.
One thing this is maybe a bit of a make the subtext text thing. Of course, people have been working on this project for many years at this point, and there are multiple, published implementations out there like Hot Chocolate and so on. But it's not a wacky coincidence that a bunch of Apollo folks showed up to this meeting, as folks may or may not have noticed by the what we've been doing, especially the past few weeks. We are planning to, be shipping defer support in several of our projects relatively soon. We are very aware of the fact that this is not, finalized either on the working, the main spec or the HTTP spec, and we are very cognizant of wanting to not put stuff. We know that on the one hand, we'll be shipping things to like customers and we'll be supporting it, but we do not want to be diverging from a future spec. So as part of what we're doing, we are explicitly making sure that not only do we do content negotiation around multi-byte mixed in the first place, which is something that I've been opening up back on in GraphQL over HTTP that I think everyone should do, but we're even planning to use like a parameter in the accept flag that like says like we are, this is the 2022-08-22, and if a few little things change between now and it being merged, we will be, make it easy for our customers in the field to migrate over. So yeah, we're really excited about working with the working groups, but also about putting this stuff in the hands of more real users, which I think will get us a lot more feedback about how to source and practice.
That's great. I always feel like I have mixed reactions to that strategy, because it's like if we could end up getting stuck with the thing that we think is wrong, but also biasing towards action is probably good in the name of feedback gathering. So I'll leave it to your smart crew to decide what the right amount of balancing act in terms of opt-in strategy is, so that there's sort of a implicit acknowledgement of subtle changes that may break the way that you're doing this may come in the future, and by opting in, you accept the potential for technical debt.
Yeah, we already, like for our GraphQL ID, we now support both payloads for different stream, because we had the one that was very similar to the original result. Now we have the incremental, so we already paying that price also for this with Hot Chocolate.
For what it's worth, though, it does feel like we are far closer to done than not done in terms of describing the payload structures. Like there was a lot of iteration on that earlier in this year. And I'm not trying to speak for everybody else, but at least I feel reasonably confident that what we've landed on is going to capture all the cases that we care about.
Yeah, and I think it's worth calling out that there are tons of people across the community who are just so excited about using this that they're willing to accept the risk at this point if things change still. So which is a good problem to have.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Rob, for being the consistent torchbearer on this one and making sure that we're always making progress. Fantastic work. We'll move on. Yakov, the next couple are yours.
Oh, okay. So I basically just want to draw attention to a few PRs. I have like 5 minutes on this one, 15 minutes on the next one, and 5 on the next. I think I can basically, I'm actually super excited about the schema metadata and applied directives. So I don't know if it would be okay with everyone, but I basically want to draw attention to just those 3 PRs. Just ask, for review, and I'll just, describe them briefly. So the first one is the separate the is subtype algorithm. And they're all sort of, some of them are interconnected. First one is separating out the is subtype from the is valid implementation field type PR. There is a lot. There's referencing in a couple different places into the spec the idea that types are subtypes. Another covariant in terms of output types, and I think it makes sense to sort of formalize that with like an is subtype algorithm, and it's also kind of useful. Item on the agenda. So I mean that's basically all I want to say about that item, agenda item 11. The next item on the agenda was clarifying the resolve abstract type algorithm. Right now, the spec just says that we, that each internal implementation, there should be an internal function that is able to, perform that in GraphQL.js. It's a method on the abstract type that can resolve it. but it doesn't describe actually what should happen in the case of errors. So basically, I just took the GraphQL JS implementation and used this like is subtype function to specify that. The idea of clarifying that, or the motivation for clarifying that, was because a couple working groups ago we had the idea of allowing that internal function to sort of chase the interface inheritance tree, meaning an abstract type could be resolved for an interface that could be resolved to maybe another interface, and eventually to an object type. I'm still not sure if we need, ever we need to do that, but I did notice that before we change the algorithm, we probably should clarify its current behavior. And so those two items basically is just a call for feedback. I don't know if it needs to be done synchronously. If people, feel an urge, please feel free. And then this next item is an additional call for feedback. I've been jumping on these working groups and a couple times in the past couple months, trying to work on expanding the subtyping. I actually don't have much new to report this month, but I did write up some of what, sort of linking together some of what, the different topics and seeing how they interrelate. So if it's okay with everyone, I'd like to basically stop it there because I'm just super excited about really hashing out the schema metadata. But I should pause. I'm sure people got very excited about these 3 topics, maybe have a bunch, maybe have some things to say. So I don't want to preempt myself if other people, want to jump in. So leave it to the group.
For the separating out is subtype, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but if you could confirm. Usually when we change algorithms in the spec, we want them to mirror real functions that exist in the reference implementation. I'm pretty sure we have a function called is type subtype or some variant like that. And its implementation is exactly this. Is that right?
I'll have to double check if it's exact. I mean, that was basically what I was working off of. So if anyone who wants to review it wants to double check my work, I think it might be called is subtype of, instead of is subtype. Double check exactly. But yes, indeed, there is a function.
Because that would be my one request before merging this, is that there is that parity. But if that already exists, then this feels like a glitch fixing.
It's there, and it's have exactly the same name. So it's like example of spec PR happening even one before implementation PR happening one before spec PR.
Oh, actually, the one in GraphQL.js is slightly more complicated, but for a different reason, I think. So I was looking at that one. I linked it.
Yeah, we're doing caching there. That's why it's like a little bit more complicated.
Oh, I see.
So we try to pre-compute stuff on schema itself, and when to also like use caching. So it's like implementation detail, but yeah, because it's used in execution. But semantically it's the same. It's
Okay. One of them manages named types, and the other one manages types, which can include null and lists, which I don't know if that's important for, for the specific case that you're looking at, resolving the abstract type. It's used in exactly the right place and in exactly the same way. So seems like the right thing to do to me. But something to keep in mind if there's other places where we end up reusing it, to be aware of that difference.
Yeah, I did notice that we might. I thought this was more natural, but at least for the current use.
Cool. Is there an order of operations? I think the first one, separating out is subtype, since that method literally already exists. I'm just going to go ahead and merge this right now. This is, let's call this an improved editorial change because it makes it actually closer to the referenceable notation. And then that at least unblocks you to get the other one in the state that you want to get it into. But I don't see any real issue with that other one either.
I mean, in terms of the motivation, to be completely honest, I've had some hesitation since Ivan and I first discussed it, and definitely since the working group meeting as to how valuable those changes would be. But I worked up, this PR to, I think, better match what should happen, and if we decide to revisit that, at least we'll have a good working base. The idea is that you have to, you can't just rely on that internal method. The internal method, you have to assert that you also basically have to assert that it's working right.
Yeah. Any particular feedback you want to get on this or discussion, or is your goal here to just kind of let everyone know that you've captured everything in one place?
From our previous discussion, I think consensus was union implementing interfaces actually makes sense, and it makes sense for clients because you use less inline fragments to specify types, and you have immediate access to fields. So I think personally from all the range of different combinations that you proposed, the first one, original one of union implementing interfaces makes sense, both from schema design and from client perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to just raise awareness with the RFC. So this is about the expanding subtyping RFC, moving to the last of those three small agenda items. So I'm surprised that there aren't more people excited about interfaces being a part of it. I think that might solve maybe some of the pain points around adding types to existing unions. But maybe I'm wrong. So I know there were others who were interested in these topics. So I just sort of thought that with putting together this RFC would sort of link together a couple of the issues and feature requests, and we could see where the community moves from there. So these issues. And now I think it's good to have a document sort of where we've come to. I think the document could be improved, integrating a little bit more of the feedback I've gotten from the previous working groups. I have to go back at the notes and refresh myself on what that feedback was in terms of the pain points. But I think this is a good starting point. I've gotten a question on one of the GitHub repos about where things stood.
Cool. All right. Sorry for the delay here. Just getting your PR in a good state. Okay. If we can use the last 15-ish minutes or so to dig into a discussion on schema metadata and applied directives. which is my topic, but Benji, I feel like part of why I wanted to reserve the time is that you had assembled this presentation, which looked really nice. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak through it.
Yeah, I made that, put too much time into that. We did also slightly skip over a topic, which was fixing ambiguity around the schema, when the schema can or should be omitted from the SDL.
Oh, I'm totally sorry about that. We did. Yeah, sorry. Let's get to that first. So that was supposed to be earlier in the agenda, and
Cool.
my eyeballs whipped over it. So
that's fine. No problem at all. So effectively, we've got two paragraphs in the spec at the moment that I feel aren't clear. These were pointed out by Roman in a related edit, but I'd like to, rather than worrying about rewriting them to be something different, what I would like to do is just clarify what they should specifically say currently. So one of the things that we have is in the first paragraph, we say that you can omit the schema definition when the query, mutation, and subscription root types are named query, mutation, and subscription, which implies that they exist, but they don't all have to exist for us to use this shortcut. So I wanted to clarify that. Separately, in the inverse situation, we say that the schema definition should be omitted if it only uses the default operation type names, but it doesn't specify that it only uses them for the root operations. So for example, if you're talking about viruses, you might talk about mutations. A mutation shouldn't necessarily be the mutation root type unless you explicitly denote that. So I have carefully rewritten the wording of this to try and encapsulate what our intent is, just be a little bit more crisp with the language. In doing so, I've introduced a term which is the default root operation type name, which is perhaps a little verbose, being 5 words, but I think it is at least useful. So quite a small change, hopefully editorial, I think, but I just wanted to get some feedback on that. However, I would like to talk about metadata, so maybe we can just do that asynchronously.
The change makes sense to me in terms of verbosity. I think root and operation are acting in synonymous ways in terms of their descriptive power, and you could probably just pick one because operations are definitionally at the root, and so root is shorter. Operation is maybe more accurate, but just pick one, and I think either is probably fine.
Yep.
Otherwise,
good.
Solid change. I'll mark it as an editorial, and once we get into a good state, I'll merge it. Oh, you already did.
Fantastic.
An editorial already.
Guys, can I ask that we have a big fight there, and this regarding the second sentence and the formulation of the situation of the second paragraph. So maybe not now, but please have a look and what we have here. In my understanding, in my impression, when I'm trying to be a freshman, a fresh reader, this is absolutely makes no sense and produces more questions than answers. And so what I'm insisting there, it's actually, I think, on my original PR, I'm trying to argue. First, we should not, in general, I feel like we should not prefer one way or another. We should not dictate when the, let's say, schema generator should skip or not. Why? But the second one is this second sentence. And Benji, if you can please increase the font size or the scale in and show this sentence, just to show you. And then let's think about it and maybe later give your opinion. But I think this likewise, right? Benji, can you please read it?
Oh, sorry, from the other thing, yeah. Likewise, when representing a GraphQL schema using the type system definition language, a schema definition should be omitted if it only uses the default root operation type names.
So basically, imagine the freshman. Likewise, when schema when representing a GraphQL schema using type system definition. When it's not representing, what else it can do? You know, and it turns out it actually speaks about the case when the schema is generated by a tool, as far as I understood from explanations. I suggested then let's change the wording here, that when you generate it from a tool, but turns out it still not covers the case, and so on. So please read this thread and let's chip in something. But for me, this second sentence, I just doesn't make much sense for a fresh reader without knowing the context of essentially what's behind this. Thank you.
Great feedback. All right. Benji, do you want to talk about granular metadata?
Yes, let's do that. Okay, so I'm not sharing the right way, but I'm just gonna go with it because it's too late now. So we've been talking about metadata, and a lot of what we've concentrated on when we talk about metadata is metadata for the schema, as in for the entire schema. And what I want to talk about is metadata requirements when you want to do small amounts of metadata. So we want to introduce new capabilities and make it useful for lots of different situations, not just a few of them. So I see that we've effectively got two types of introspection. We've got the tooling that consumes introspection. So things like graphical, like the documentation generators, composing schemas, GraphQL code generator, things like that. But we also have this _type field that you can use to introspect just an individual type. And at the moment, I don't see that widely used. And I think one of the main reasons that it's not widely used is because we can't associate any additional metadata with that. So for example, if you've got some enums, you might want to associate what the human readable labels are with them or something like that. And at the moment, there's no way to do that. So for this talk, imagine that we're building a web app. We've got a whole bunch of clients. We've got the web client, we've got the iOS client, we've got Android, we've got maybe desktop, all written in different programming languages. And we want to be able to iterate quickly across all the different platforms. And we want to be able to distribute these sort of small behavioral changes just via the GraphQL schema and have them reflected almost immediately without having to wait for new App Store review and things like that when we want to change, you know, a slight permission or something like that, or add a new option to a dropdown. And we want to make sure that everything is consistent across all of our apps. So here's some use cases. One that I see quite a lot in the clients that I work with is the desire for these kind of user-controlled tables where you can filter them, you can change the sorting of them, and various other behaviors. And this is the kind of thing that could quite easily, if we had metadata, be controlled by that metadata. So you could say, oh, this column is sortable, and this thing should be given this name. Here are the options that should go into any dropdown. And this could be quite a consistent way of applying this functionality to various sections of your schema. Yeah. Then there's also things like shared validation logic. So if you've got a form with validation logic like this, you may want to be able to share the rules for each of the fields. And it would be nice to share them in a way that was then be able to be used across multiple of your applications. And importantly, to be able to change them on the fly. If you find out that your email address validation rule is wrong, maybe you want to just fix that in your GraphQL schema and have all of your clients reflect that new regex instantly, rather than having to wait for everything to go through App Store review or something like that, just to fix a very minor issue. Also helps to synchronize this logic. You also could extend that a little bit further and actually have schema-driven forms where for different mutations, you say, here are the inputs. And if you add a new input that was optional before, like a checkbox to say that I agree to the terms or something like that, you could just add it to the schema and have it auto-reflected. So that is another use case for it. Yet another use case is gating features based on permissions and things like that. You could indicate next to a mutation, here are the roles or the subscription level that the user needs in order to use this feature. And that means that from a business perspective, you could say, oh, actually, we're going to roll this feature out to everyone. And just in the schema, you just change that flag. And now all of your applications automatically enable it for everyone without you, again, having to release whole new versions of the app. Also means you could do something like that for a weekend. Here, we're going to have the pro weekend where everyone gets the pro account just this one weekend without having to release new versions. Another one that I think is more universal is pagination limits, indicating what the limits are on the various connections that we have across our GraphQL schema, and allowing people to change those. If it turns out that fetching 100 rows of a particular collection is very expensive, maybe on the server side, you want to drop that down to a limit of 50, and you want all of your applications to reflect that new limit, then indicating that through introspection would be desirable. And that's something that even GraphQL could benefit from, because it would then know, how do I, what options do I show when it comes to showing the collection in the sidebar? There's also like a whole bunch of other stuff like dynamic dropdowns, like what you've got on GitHub, for example, stream and defer, like saying what you should use for the initial count, or even if it makes sense to stream or defer a particular field. And also information about the schema itself, like what version is the schema? Do I need to pull down new introspection information? So all of that, I think we need to use the _type field for that, and we need metadata. And the metadata might grow quite large because we might be indicating a bunch of different topics. And when we request it from the client, we probably only care about one or two of those topics at a time. So ideally, we would only pull down those little bits of metadata that we care about, not everything. But my main concern is, I am concerned if we use a string type for this, we stringify to a GraphQL language, for example, that we require a parser, which means we need to bundle a parser with every client. But also that it means if we were to change the syntax in the language, it would make it hard to, if we were to add something to one of our metadata types that needed this new syntax, suddenly all those existing clients that were reliant on that would potentially throw errors at the parsing stage, which doesn't seem desirable. At the moment, we've used that for the default value field. But generally, from a client perspective, we just care whether there is a default value or not. We don't actually care what its value is unless you're, for example, graphical and you actually want to render that, but it doesn't tend to actually be used. So I think that metadata doesn't really fall into the same bucket as default value. If we can avoid needing a parser, for example, by using something like JSON or some more standard format that we use in GraphQL, like we use for responding to object type fields, for example, then we should be able to add new features without breaking backwards compatibility. That was my presentation.
This makes a lot of sense, though it challenges the way that I'd been thinking about introspection to this point, which may also challenge some of the assumptions we've made around that, which is introspection is a feature used by developers at development time, and the rest of the schema is used by the deployed applications in production. And one example of leaning on that is there are many people who use GraphQL who restrict access to introspection. They block queries that use the introspection fields outside of a development environment, which would break a lot of the use cases suggested here. And I wonder if a lot of these things that should be dynamic, like the applications automatically update based on changes to metadata, if those ought to be part of a schema, like an application's schema describes the way in which a schema-driven form or dynamic validation logic were to update. So that way an application knows that it must fetch that first before it render something to send a mutation.
So I've worked with a few clients that have actually done this in the application schema. And the problem that they often come up with is that actually the functionality relates to their GraphQL types. It relates to their fields, their mutations, things like that. And linking to those in the application schema is cumbersome. It just doesn't feel natural because you've got something that you're getting through one resource and then you're kind of not linking it tightly from another. And for most of them, it does feel like these aren't things that you're going to change very often. You would change them, as part of your schema. Maybe you even define it alongside your schema. And at the moment, they're effectively then pulling those out and then reinserting them into the schema in the user space and then linking them back together again in the client, which is not ideal.
Would there be a way to manage permissions on metadata then, similarly to how permissions can be managed, I guess, on resolvers?
I don't think there's any desire for that, certainly not from my perspective. I think that it should just be things like you would express in the directives that Lee proposed, i.e. you just add it to your schema and it's part of that schema definition. If metadata should be protected, then that should be part of your application schema rather than the introspection schema.
But the argument is valid, like it's moving introspection into the application space. Like it would be a lot more involved in building your application, which it's at the moment not. When I thought about the directives or so, it's more around like distributed graphs. I mean, that's the use case I often have in mind, which is kind of in the development space.
Yeah, and I think whatever we come up with for metadata, it would be ideal that it solves both of these problems. And that's my main concern at the moment, is that we're making a few decisions, or at least we're leading towards certain decisions that I think will severely limit these use cases that I propose here. I absolutely think that we need them for like schema composition and stuff as well, but I don't think there's anything in what I've proposed that would prevent those things from working. In fact, I personally think they would work better because you don't need like a custom parser or a GraphQL parser for it, etc.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean that, right? It's just that I didn't think we want to shift it so far into the user space. Sorry, Lee.
No worries. I just wanted to wrap things up with the last thought and let everyone disappear, which the use cases here are great. And I think maybe the way that I'll fold this into our thought process around schema metadata is not necessarily to say that we should go suggest people use introspection in this way, but to the degree that they might want to, we should not end up in a solution that makes it additionally challenging to do this unnecessarily. That might be the most helpful way to think about this, which I think maps closer to the conclusions that you got to around what's safe and not safe about a parser, which we can kind of dig into asynchronously. But thank you for settling this. This was actually really helpful to kind of think through the cases in which metadata might be used beyond the ways in which we've thought about it so far, which can help inform the shape of a proposal we want to assemble. With that, we're roughly at time. So thank you everyone for hanging in there. I know we didn't take a 5-minute break this time around, but the next one and beyond, they'll be a little bit shorter. So appreciate it. Appreciate everyone's time and attention on everything. Thank you to everyone who's been doing all the excellent work, and see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye guys.